The morning Lucien Jericho rode into Redemption Springs was the same morning Grace Rawlins buried her father, a coincidence folks would later call Providence, though neither believed in such things at the time. Dust from the drought-stricken plains of Colorado Territory swirled around the small gathering at the cemetery as Grace stood motionless, her black mourning dress catching the wind while the preacher spoke hollow words about salvation and eternal peace. The year was 1876. The nation had just celebrated its centennial, but here on the frontier, such celebrations seemed distant as survival remained the daily concern. Grace watched as the final shovelful of dirt covered her father's pine box, her thoughts not on prayers but on the mountain of debt he'd left behind and the saloon she now owned but couldn't keep. Lucien observed the burial from atop his dappled gray stallion at a respectful distance. His trail-worn clothes and the Winchester rifle resting across his saddle marked him as a man familiar with the hardships of the West. At 32, his face had weathered like tanned leather, lines etched around blue eyes that missed little. He had come to Redemption Springs following whispers of work, having left behind a past in Wyoming that still haunted his dreams. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the preacher concluded, closing his Bible with finality. The small crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the oppressive heat. Grace remained, a solitary figure against the backdrop of makeshift wooden crosses and stone markers. It wasn't until Sheriff Miller approached her that she finally moved. "Miss Rawlins," the sheriff said, removing his hat, "my condolences, your father was a good man." Grace nodded stiffly. They both knew it wasn't entirely true. Thomas Rawlins had been many things: a dreamer, a gambler, occasionally a drunk, but his goodness had been inconsistent at best. "When will you be requiring my decision about the saloon?" she asked, her voice steady despite her grief. "The bank's given you until the end of the month," Sheriff Miller replied, shifting uncomfortably. "Mr. Harrington is eager to acquire the property." "I'm sure he is," Grace said bitterly, thinking of the wealthy cattle baron who had been pressuring her father to sell for years. As they spoke, Lucien approached, leading his horse. He'd waited until most had gone, not wanting to intrude but needing information about the town. "Pardon me," he said, tipping his hat. "I don't mean to disturb your grieving. I'm looking for work and a place to stay." Sheriff Miller eyed the stranger with practiced suspicion. "What kind of work?" "Any honest kind," Lucien replied. "I've worked cattle, broken horses, even tended bar." At the mention of tending bar, Grace looked up sharply, taking in the stranger properly for the first time. He stood tall, his posture straight despite obvious exhaustion. There was something in his eyes, a sadness perhaps, or a wariness that resonated with her. "The Dusty Boot Saloon needs a barkeep," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. "That is, if you know your way around a whiskey bottle." Lucien's lips curved slightly. "Yes, madam, I believe I do." Sheriff Miller frowned. "Grace, are you certain you don't know this man?" "I don't know much of anything anymore," Grace replied with unexpected candor, "but I need help at the saloon if I'm to have any hope of keeping it." And so it began, a desperate arrangement born of necessity that would change both their lives irrevocably. That evening, Grace showed Lucien around the Dusty Boot. The saloon had seen better days, but it still maintained a certain charm with its polished mahogany bar and ornate mirror shipped all the way from St. Louis. The piano in the corner had gone silent with her father's death. He had been the only one who played it with any skill. "There's a room upstairs you can use," Grace explained, lighting a lamp as dusk settled. "It's not much, but it's clean." "More than fair," Lucien said, setting his saddlebags down. "I've slept under the stars more nights than not these past few years." "The saloon opens at noon," she continued. "Most nights are quiet except for Fridays when the cattle hands come to town." Lucien nodded, taking in the details of his new workplace. "If you don't mind my asking, how long have you owned this establishment?" "Since approximately 10 hours ago," Grace replied with a touch of gallows humor. "My father built it when I was a child. It was all he had to leave me, and even that's mortgaged to the hilt." She moved behind the bar, pulling out a bottle and 2 glasses with practiced ease. "I grew up here, though proper ladies aren't supposed to admit such things." She poured 2 fingers of whiskey in each glass and slid one toward him. "To new beginnings," she offered. "To new beginnings," he echoed, raising his glass. The whiskey burned pleasantly, warming Lucien from within. He studied Grace surreptitiously as she drank. She couldn't have been more than 25, with striking amber eyes and chestnut hair restrained in a practical bun. Despite her morning attire, there was a quiet strength about her that commanded respect. "I should warn you," Grace said, setting down her empty glass. "This town has opinions about a woman running a saloon alone. They'll have even more about me hiring a stranger the day of my father's funeral." "People always have opinions," Lucien replied. "I've found it's best to give them something else to talk about soon enough." Grace smiled then, the first genuine one he'd seen. "Mr. Jericho, I believe we might get along after all." The following days established a routine. Lucien proved himself an efficient bartender and handy with repairs. He fixed the leaking roof, mended broken chairs, and even tuned the neglected piano, though he denied any ability to play it. Grace managed the books and dealt with suppliers, her head for business surprising those who had underestimated her. Word spread quickly about the handsome new barkeep at the Dusty Boot. Business improved as curious townsfolk came to see the stranger for themselves and stayed for his easy manner and generous pours. One afternoon, as Grace balanced the ledgers, Sheriff Miller entered the saloon. He removed his hat and approached her table. "Miss Rawlins, there's something you should know," he said quietly. "I've made some inquiries about your new employee." Grace set down her pencil. "And the name Lucien Jericho is known in Wyoming territory. He was a gunfighter, a hired gun for the Barlow outfit during the range wars." Grace's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "That was then, he's working for me now." "A man doesn't leave that life behind so easily," the sheriff warned. "Harrington's been asking questions too. He's not pleased about the saloon's recent success." After Miller left, Grace remained at her table, thoughts churning. That evening, as Lucien wiped down the bar after closing, she confronted him. "Were you going to tell me about Wyoming?" she asked directly, his hands stilled on the cloth. "Eventually, when the time was right." "Is it true? Were you a gunfighter?" Lucien met her gaze steadily. "Yes, I've done things I'm not proud of, Miss Rawlins. I came here looking for something different." "Why did you leave that life?" He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I grew tired of burying friends and enemies. Mostly I grew tired of who I'd become." Grace studied him, searching for deceit and finding none. "This town has been good to my family. I won't have violence brought to it." "I understand," he said. "If you want me to leave—" "No," she interrupted. "But I need to know if trouble will follow you here." "It shouldn't," he answered honestly. "Most who would remember me think I'm dead. I'd prefer to keep it that way." Grace nodded slowly. "Then we'll say no more about it. We all deserve second chances, Mr. Jericho." As weeks passed, their working relationship evolved into something resembling friendship. Lucien learned that Grace had been educated in Denver, returning only when her father's health began failing. She discovered his quiet appreciation for literature when she found him reading her copy of the Iliad during slow afternoons. Friday nights remained the busiest, with cowboys from surrounding ranches filling the saloon. On one such evening, 3 of Harrington's men entered, already half drunk and looking for trouble. "Well, if it ain't the prettiest widow in Colorado," one called out to Grace as she served drinks. "My father was the widow, Mr. Tanner, not me," she corrected calmly. "What can I get you gentlemen? How about a fair price for this rundown place?" Another said, too loudly. "Mr. Harrington's been more than patient." "The Dusty Boot isn't for sale," Grace replied firmly. The third man, Davis, leaned across the bar. "It will be when the bank forecloses." "Smart woman would take the offer while it stands." Lucien appeared at Grace's side. "I believe the lady has answered your question. Your drinks are on the house tonight if you keep civil tongues in your heads." Davis sized up Lucien, noting the way he stood balanced, ready. Something in Lucien's steady gaze made him reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. "3 whiskeys, then," Davis muttered. "Your finest." Later that night, after the last patron had staggered home, Grace found Lucien sitting on the back steps, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. "Thank you for earlier," she said, settling beside him. He shrugged. "Just doing my job." "Is that all it was?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. "No," he admitted finally. "It wasn't just that." Grace nodded, drawing her shawl tighter against the night chill. "Harrington won't stop. He wants this land for the water rights. The creek that runs behind the saloon is the only one that doesn't dry up in summer. Men like Harrington understand only one thing, Lucien said darkly. No, Grace touched his arm lightly. That's not who you are anymore. That's not who we are. We'll find another way. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face, illuminated by moonlight. For a moment it seemed he might say something more, might close the distance between them. Instead, he crushed out his cigarette. We should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's another day. The next morning, Reverend Abernathy visited the saloon before opening. The preacher's visits had become frequent since Thomas Rawlins' death. His concern for Grace's spiritual welfare transparently mingled with disapproval of her choice to continue running the establishment. Miss Rawlins, I've come to invite you to Sunday services, he announced, standing awkwardly in the middle of the empty saloon. That's kind, Reverend, but I have inventory to complete, Grace replied, continuing to count bottles. Your absence has been noted by the congregation, he persisted. Many are concerned for your soul, especially now that you've taken up your father's profession. Lucien emerged from the storeroom carrying a crate of supplies. The preacher's expression soured visibly. Mr. Jericho, he acknowledged stiffly. I was just explaining to Miss Rawlins the importance of maintaining appearances. A young unmarried woman living above a saloon with a male employee gives rise to talk. Does it now? Lucien set down the crate. Seems to me talk is the least of Miss Rawlins' concerns right now. The Reverend drew himself up. The moral welfare of this community is my concern. This establishment has long been a blight on our town's character. Funny, Grace interjected. The same establishment funded the church roof repairs last winter when the collection plate came up short. Reverend Abernathy flushed. That was your father's generosity, may he rest in peace, but you, Miss Rawlins, a woman of your upbringing should not be consorting with. He glanced meaningfully at Lucien. His kind, Grace's voice sharpened. And what kind would that be, Reverend? A sinner, the preacher stated bluntly. A man with blood on his hands. Word travels, Miss Rawlins, even to our remote corner of the territory. You can't love a sinner and expect God's grace. The room fell silent. Grace set down her pencil deliberately, facing the preacher squarely. Then I'll love what heaven forgot, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Good day, Reverend. After a moment of shocked silence, the preacher departed, the door closing firmly behind him. Grace turned to find Lucien staring at her, an unreadable expression on his face. You shouldn't have said that, he said finally. Why not? It's the truth. Grace crossed the room to stand before him. You're not the only one seeking redemption, Lucien. This town has judged me since I was a child because of where I lived, who my father was. I'm tired of it. They'll make things harder for you now. Let them try, she replied. I've survived worse. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. They emerged from the saloon to find a crowd gathering around the bank across the street. Sheriff Miller stood on the steps, addressing the townspeople. The stage was robbed 10 miles east of town, he announced. 2 passengers wounded. I'm forming a posse to track the bandits. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Stage robberies had been increasing in the territory, but none so close to Redemption Springs before. How many were there? Someone called out. 3, according to the driver, masked men well armed. Lucien tensed beside Grace. She glanced at him questioningly. What is it? She whispered. The timing, he replied softly, with Harrington pressing you to sell. Grace's eyes widened as she understood his implication. You think he arranged this to frighten people, to make them doubt the sheriff's ability to maintain order? It wouldn't be the first time a man like him used fear to get what he wants. The sheriff continued. I need volunteers. We'll leave within the hour. Several men stepped forward, including Davis and the other ranch hands who had confronted Grace in the saloon. This concerns me, Lucien muttered. Harrington's men are too eager. What are you going to do? Grace asked, already knowing the answer. I need to join that posse. Keep an eye on things. Grace caught his arm. Be careful, please. He covered her hand with his own briefly. Always am. The posse departed at noon, leaving Redemption Springs unusually quiet. Grace opened the saloon as normal, though few customers came. As dusk approached, Edwin Harrington himself entered, accompanied by his foreman. Grace had seen the cattle baron in town occasionally, but he had never before set foot in the Dusty Boot. Miss Rawlins, Harrington greeted her, removing his expensive hat. A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. Grace nodded coolly. Mr. Harrington, what can I offer you? Just a moment of your time. He glanced around the empty saloon. I see your new barkeep joined the posse. Admirable community spirit for a newcomer. Mr. Jericho takes his responsibilities seriously, Grace replied. Harrington smiled thinly. Indeed. Well, in his absence, I thought we might discuss business. My offer for your property still stands $5,000, more than generous considering the outstanding mortgage. As I've told your men repeatedly, the Dusty Boot isn't for sale. Miss Rawlins, Harrington's voice hardened slightly, you must understand your situation. The bank payment is due in 1 week. You're running a failing business in a town that disapproves of your very presence. Take the money, start fresh somewhere else. And if I refuse? Then I'll acquire this property anyway when the bank forecloses, he shrugged. But you'll walk away with nothing instead of a substantial sum, not a wise choice for a woman alone. Grace straightened, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not alone, Mr. Harrington, and I'm not selling. Now, unless you'd like a drink, I'll have to ask you to leave. Harrington's pleasant facade cracked momentarily, revealing cold anger beneath. You'll regret this obstinance, Miss Rawlins. Good evening. After they departed, Grace locked the door behind them, her hands trembling slightly. She knew the threat was real. The bank payment loomed, and despite improved business, she was still short of the necessary funds. It was past midnight when she heard horses approaching. Peering out the window, she saw the posse returning, fewer in number than when they'd departed. She rushed outside, searching anxiously for Lucien. Sheriff Miller dismounted wearily. His arm was bandaged and blood had seeped through the cloth. What happened? Grace asked, dread building within her. Ambush, Miller replied grimly. We followed the trail to Serpent Canyon. They were waiting for us, the bandits. Weren't no ordinary bandits, one of the townsmen interjected. Professionals, well-armed. Grace scanned the returning riders again. Where's Mr. Jericho? A heavy silence fell over the group. Miller removed his hat. I'm sorry, Miss Rawlins. Jericho and 2 others fell in the initial volley. We couldn't recover the bodies, the canyon walls were too steep. The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. You're certain? She managed to ask. Saw him fall myself, Davis said, not meeting her eyes. Took a bullet to the chest. No surviving that. Grace nodded mechanically, turned, and walked back into the saloon without another word. Inside, she moved behind the bar, poured herself a full glass of whiskey, and drank it in one burning swallow. The grief hit her with unexpected force. She had known Lucien for barely a month, yet his loss left a void that seemed unbridgeable. In the quiet of the empty saloon, she finally allowed herself to weep. The following days passed in a fog. Grace opened and closed the saloon by rote, serving drinks and making small talk while feeling nothing. The bank payment deadline approached with cruel inevitability. She had come to accept that she would lose everything. 3 days after the ambush, near closing time, a stranger entered the Dusty Boot. He was Mexican, middle-aged, with a face weathered by sun and hardship. Senorita Rawlins, he asked, approaching the bar cautiously. Grace nodded warily. The man glanced around, ensuring they were alone. I have message from Senor Jericho. Grace froze, her heart stuttering. That's impossible. Mr. Jericho is dead. The man shook his head. No, senorita, wounded yes, dead no, he sends this. He placed a folded paper on the bar. With trembling fingers, Grace opened the note. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably Lucien's. Grace, trust no one. The ambush was planned. Davis and the others working for Harrington. I'm at Miguel's cabin on Bear Creek. Come if you can. Danger follows. L. She looked up at the messenger. Miguel, he nodded. I am Miguel. Senor Lucien saved my son years ago in Wyoming. Now I repay debt. He is hurt bad but alive. You come tonight? Yes, Grace replied without hesitation. Give me 10 minutes to gather supplies. Miguel waited while Grace collected bandages, medicines, food, and a rifle from beneath the bar. She changed into riding clothes, strapped on her father's revolver, and left a note for Mrs. Caldwell next door, claiming a sudden trip to visit a sick relative. They rode through the night, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed. Dawn was breaking when they reached a small cabin nestled against a pine-covered hillside. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney. Miguel helped Grace dismount. He is weak from blood loss. Bullet passed through shoulder. Fever comes and goes. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but clean. Lucien lay on a narrow bed in the corner, his face ashen, dark stubble contrasting sharply with his pallor. His eyes were closed, but at the sound of their entrance they fluttered open. "Grace," he whispered, as though afraid she might be a fever dream. She rushed to his side, tears blurring her vision. "You fool," she said, taking his hand. "I thought you were dead." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not for lack of trying on their part. Grace examined his wound as Miguel prepared fresh coffee. The bullet had indeed passed through cleanly, but infection had set in. She set to work immediately, cleaning the wound with whiskey and applying fresh poultices of herbs Miguel's wife had prepared. As she worked, Lucien explained what had happened. "It was a setup from the start. Davis led us into that canyon deliberately. I suspected something was wrong and hung back. When the shooting started, I took a bullet but managed to roll down into the ravine. They thought me dead." "Miguel found you." He was hunting nearby, heard the gunfire, recognized me from years back when I helped his family during the range wars. Grace finished bandaging his shoulder. "Harrington came to the saloon while you were gone, offered to buy it again." "And you refused," Lucien stated, knowing her answer. "Of course." Grace sat beside him, suddenly exhausted. "The bank payment is due in 4 days. I don't have enough." "Check my saddlebags," Lucien instructed. "Left pocket." Miguel brought the bags over. Inside the pocket, Grace found a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. "Where did this come from?" she asked, surprised. "Been carrying it for years," Lucien explained. "What I had left from my gunfighting days. Never felt right spending it until now." "Lucien, I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted. "Consider it an investment. I'm partial to that saloon." "Just the saloon?" she asked softly. His eyes held hers. "No, not just the saloon." Miguel tactfully stepped outside, leaving them alone. Grace reached out, gently touching Lucien's face. "When I thought you were dead," she began. "I know," he said. "I felt the same when I thought I might not make it back to you." She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with shared emotion. When they parted, both were breathless. "We need to stop Harrington," Lucien said. "End this once and for all." "How? It's his word against ours about the ambush. He's the most powerful man in the county." "Not quite," Lucien replied. "I managed to recognize one of the bandits before I fell. It was Harrington's son, James." Grace's eyes widened. "His son was part of the stage robbery. Are you certain?" "Positive." His mask slipped. "That's why they were so intent on eliminating the posse to protect the boy. James has always been Harrington's weak spot." "We need proof," Grace mused. "Miguel's been watching the Harrington ranch. James returned there yesterday, wounded. If we can get the sheriff to search the ranch, find the stolen items from the stage." "Sheriff Miller might listen," Grace said. "He's always been fair, even if he disapproves of the saloon." They spent the next 2 days planning while Lucien regained his strength. On the morning of the 3rd day, Grace rode into town alone, heading directly to the sheriff's office. She found Miller at his desk, looking tired and troubled. "Miss Rawlins," he greeted her with surprise. "I heard you'd left town." "Not permanently," she replied. "Sheriff, I have information about the stage robbery and the ambush." Miller's expression grew guarded. "What information?" Grace took a deep breath. "Lucien Jericho is alive. He survived the ambush and witnessed James Harrington among the robbers." The sheriff stared at her in disbelief. "That's a serious accusation. Jericho's dead, Miss Rawlins. Davis saw him fall." "Davis is working for Harrington, as were the other ranch hands in the posse," Grace insisted. "It was all arranged to eliminate witnesses." "You expect me to believe Edwin Harrington, a respected rancher, arranged for his own son to rob a stage?" Miller shook his head. "Grief can make people imagine things, Miss Rawlins." Grace placed a folded paper on his desk. Lucien's detailed account of what he'd seen, signed and dated. "Read it," she urged. "Then search the Harrington ranch. The stolen strongbox is likely hidden there along with James, who was wounded in the ambush." Miller hesitated, then took the paper. As he read, his expression slowly changed from skepticism to concern. "This matches details only someone present would know," he admitted reluctantly. "But I can't search Harrington's property without cause that would stand up to scrutiny. His influence reaches all the way to the territorial governor." "What about this?" Grace placed a brass button on his desk. "Miguel found it at the ambush site. It's from James Harrington's jacket, custom made with the Triple H brand. Compare it to the jacket James always wears." Miller picked up the button, examining it closely. After a long moment, he nodded. "This might be enough. I'll need deputies I can trust." "Be careful," Grace warned. "Harrington has men everywhere." "Not everywhere," Miller replied grimly. "My brother was on that stage. He's still recovering from his wounds. This is personal now." Grace returned to the cabin with news that Miller would move on the Harrington ranch the following morning. Lucien was up and moving around. His color improved, though he still favored his injured shoulder. "You should have waited for me," he chided when she told him of her meeting with the sheriff. "There wasn't time," Grace replied. "The bank payment is due tomorrow. Besides, you're still healing." "I'm well enough to protect what's mine," he said fiercely. Grace raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is yours, Mr. Jericho?" He stepped closer, his good arm slipping around her waist. "My heart, for one thing. Seems you've claimed it completely." "Have I?" she asked, smiling up at him. "From the moment you offered a stranger work on the day you buried your father," he confirmed. "Your courage, your determination, I never stood a chance." "Good," she whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him, "because I have no intention of letting you go again." They spent the night planning for every contingency. At dawn, they rode together to the bank in Redemption Springs. Grace paid the mortgage installment with Lucien's gold, securing the saloon for another month. As they emerged, they saw a commotion near the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered to watch as Sheriff Miller and 4 deputies led James Harrington and 2 other men down the street in handcuffs. Following behind them came Edwin Harrington himself, red-faced and shouting threats. "This is an outrage," the cattle baron bellowed. "My son has done nothing wrong. You'll regret this, Miller." The sheriff ignored him, marching his prisoners toward the jail. When he spotted Grace and Lucien, his step faltered momentarily, but he nodded in acknowledgement before continuing. Word spread quickly through town. The stolen strongbox had been found hidden in James Harrington's quarters, along with masks and weapons matching the stage robbers' descriptions. More damning still, James had been found nursing a gunshot wound similar to what Sheriff Miller had described inflicting on one of the ambushers. Edwin Harrington departed town that afternoon, headed for the territorial capital to engage attorneys. Before leaving, he stopped his carriage outside the Dusty Boot, where Grace and Lucien stood watching. "This isn't over," he warned. "No jury in the territory will convict my son on the word of a hired gun and a saloon woman." "Perhaps not," Lucien replied calmly, "but they might listen to the Wells Fargo agent who's already on his way to investigate the robbery of their stage. Or to the families of the men who died in that ambush." Harrington's face contorted with rage. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Jericho." "Not the first time," Lucien shrugged. "Likely won't be the last. But understand this, Harrington, the Dusty Boot stays where it is, and so do we." After Harrington departed, Grace turned to Lucien. "He won't give up easily." "No," Lucien agreed, "but neither will we." That evening, they reopened the saloon to a curious crowd eager for details about the scandal. Business was better than it had been in years, with even some of the church ladies stopping by just for a moment to hear the news firsthand. Late that night, after the last customer had left, Grace locked the front door and turned to find Lucien seated at the piano, picking out a simple melody with his good hand. "I thought you said you couldn't play," she remarked, joining him on the bench. "I said I wouldn't claim any ability," he corrected with a smile. "Never said I couldn't play at all." Grace leaned against his uninjured side. "What happens now?" "Well," he considered, "I suspect there will be a trial. Harrington will fight, but the evidence is substantial after that." He turned to face her fully. "After that depends on you, on me." "Yes, you see, I find myself increasingly attached to a certain saloon and its owner. I thought perhaps I might make my stay in Redemption Springs permanent if that arrangement would suit the proprietress." Grace pretended to consider this seriously. "The proprietress has become rather fond of her barkeep. I believe a permanent arrangement could be negotiated." "Good," Lucien murmured, bending to kiss her softly. "Because I love you, Grace Rawlins, sinner that I am." "Then it's fortunate," she replied, smiling against his lips, "that I love what heaven forgot." 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony beside the creek behind the saloon. Reverend Abernathy refused to officiate, but a circuit judge was happy to do the honors. The Dusty Boot closed for the day, its first closure in over 20 years, to host the celebration. James Harrington was convicted and sentenced to prison for his crimes. His father sold his holdings and moved east, his influence in the territory broken. Sheriff Miller stood as Lucien's best man, their shared experiences having forged an unlikely friendship. The saloon thrived under its new management. Grace and Lucien eventually added a small restaurant that became famous for its pies throughout the county. They maintained the establishment's tradition of fairness, offering credit to those in need and work to those seeking a second chance. 2 years after their wedding, their daughter was born, a strong-willed girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. They named her Hope, for what they had found in each other when they least expected it. And on quiet evenings, when the saloon was closed and their daughter asleep, Lucien would play the old piano while Grace sang songs her father had taught her. Together, they built the life that neither had dared imagine, possible proof that sometimes, what heaven forgets, love remembers.